All right. Welcome everybody that's been able to make it so far. Just do a brief intro and some kind of administrative things out of the way, and then we'll move on to Sarah, our presenter. Uh, Firstly, you should have seen in your emails, if you're a member of our any of our mailing lists, that the registration for the 75th International Annual Conference for SWCS has gone out. I believe that went out on Tuesday, maybe it was Wednesday. Either way, it was very recently. Again, I announced this last week as well, but the rate if you're a member of SWCS of any chapter or the National Society is $75. And then the non-member rate is $99. And this is an all-annual conference held mostly via Zoom, so very similar to what we're doing here today. And it's going to be a great conference with a lot of varying topics. We had most of our presenters that were planning to come to the physical conference stay on and remain interested in presenting digitally. So that'll be great. And you can find more information on that at the website listed here on the splash screen, swcs.org/20AC. Another item of note along with this 75th annual conference is a couple of different swag things we have on offer, so to speak. So we've got some t-shirts. I'm actually wearing one right now. The conservation professional stressing about climate science since the Dust Bowl one, which was my personal favorite. Those are available on the SWCS site or specifically the bonfire.com store. But you can find a link to that from the SWCS site, which should be the easiest way to find it. And then the Iowa chapter is also doing a promo of a pint glass for the 75th annual conference. This one has the 75th logo on it, plus an etching of the state of Iowa outline. So it's a great looking pint glass. Those are available at pmapparel.com. For some more information, here's the actual site you can go to, but you can also find this from the swcs.org website or the Iowa chapter subsite. These are great looking glasses. I know I already got my order in. They have some flexible shipping options. If you live in the state of Iowa, you can get flat $7 delivery fee for however many you would like. Or $12 with UPS for more nationwide delivery. And then if you're in the Des Moines area, it's free pickup at the store in Polk City. And PM Apparel is a woman-run business, small business that's Iowa-based, third generation. So we're supporting them as well as the Iowa chapter. The proceeds from this all come back to the Iowa chapter in this case. So you can do your part to help the Iowa chapter out and also kind of, wear a fun little badge, or not wear it, but drink from it for the conference when we are participating in that this later this summer. Today's speaker is Sarah Carlson. She's Strategic Initiatives Director at Practical Farmers of Iowa. Her title is Changing the Cover Crop Message. I think I mentioned it last week, but I'm really interested in where she's going to go with this topic. Sarah joined the Practical Farmers of Iowa staff in the fall of 2007. She's the Strategic Initiatives Director, and she helped transfer agronomic research about cover crops and small grains through supply chain projects, articles, blogs, and presentation materials while working to improve the support for cover crop and small grain research. She also serves as an agronomist on the staff, transferring ideas for solutions to integrated crop and livestock concerns from farmers' stories, results from on-farm research projects, and her own knowledge as a trained agronomist. So everybody welcome Sarah, and we're going to transfer presentation duties over to her and get her to share her screen.
Great, thanks for having me. Well, my screen loads here a second. Okay, Steve, can you see my PowerPoint there?
Yep, looks good.
Okay, great. All right, well, thanks again for having me today. I'm going to go over some of PFI's research on cover crops and also talk about this bigger idea about how we should be changing our cover crop message so that we can advance adoption of the practice more to those middle adopter farmers who haven't yet started out trying it on their farms. So for those of you who don't know who PFI is, I'm just going to give a little bit of background of who Practical Farmers is. So, our main mission is for farmers to share out research results and, you know, information about how things work on their farms with others. And so we want to equip farmers to build resilient farms and ultimately improve rural vibrancy among, you know, rural folks. And so we're a member-led nonprofit organization, and we have about 4,200 members. This is a picture here of Chris Teachout in a soil pit at one of his field days, you know, sharing about how soil health has changed on his farm based on practices. And so, you know, many of you have maybe attended PFI field days or other types of annual conference events where we help farmers share more with other farmers and others about practices that they're trying on their farm. And here's a distribution of our membership. Again, we're a growing organization. We have well surpassed the 3,700 number that we were in 2018. And now we're near 4,200 members across the state and then surrounding states in the Corn Belt as well. And so our big flagship program that we've been doing since Dick Thompson founded PFI in 1985 is the Cooperators Program. And I'm going to share research results from that program today. And so you'll notice there is a picture, not just of the farmers in the middle who conduct research, but also strip trials and what they look like on farm. And so we help farmers set up over 72 trials in 2019. And those are all in randomized replicated strips. And that helped us derive scientific results, scientifically rigorous results from our trials so that we can say, okay, these practices work. These practices maybe we need to refine, and so that we can share with other farmers the best way to make changes on their farm with new practices. And then after farmers do that research, we help them get out the door and share those results with other members and other farmers and others across the landscape. So in 2018, for example, we reached about 10,000 people face to face. That was at 147 events, and 230 members taught or shared information at those events. And so we have a robust grassroots network that helps farmers engage with others across the landscape. In 2020, unfortunately, we, just like the SWCS conference, are going to need to host all of our field days virtually. And so you'll be noticing all of our events online through our website, either live, streamed live to Facebook, or we'll be hosting Zoom type webinars similar to our Farminar series, depending on the type of event with the farmer. So be looking for our field days. We're still doing a strong showing this summer, but they'll all be virtual. So all of this work that we've been doing, all of the on-farm research, all of the farmer-to-farmer sharing is all so that we can help others save a lot of time and money. So we want to be able to figure out what works, what needs changed, and then help share out those learnings so that others can make quick changes on their farm and just save a bunch of time to get there. So I wanted to kind of talk about this idea of messaging today. I think it's important as practitioners, as farmers, as those who are interested in conservation and cover crops, to think about how we talk about these practices. And so, you know, some of the reasons that we've talked about cover crops have been a more conservation appeal. We've come to cover crops for certain reasons like water and soil. But if we want to reach other farmers who maybe aren't as interested in those benefits, we need to really change our cover crop message. And so I'm going to kind of go over that today. So why are we all on Team Cover Crops? For those that are watching this, I hope you're on Team Cover Crops. If you're not, hopefully by the end of this, you will be. And so what do I mean by Team Cover Crops? So, you know, many of us learned about cover crops a decade or more ago. We learned information from Iowa's nutrient reduction strategy on the practices that most influence water quality. You can see here, this is a interpretation of the nutrient reduction strategy science assessment from Iowa Soybean Association, where the practices in green, like pasture, land retirement, extended crop rotation, have very positive effects on improving water quality. So bars to the right of the graph are reductions in nitrate loss. And we see practices like wetlands, bioreactors, those in blue, those edge of field practices, those also have a big benefit to certain parts of a field and at improving water quality and reducing nitrate loading. And then we see the orange practices like cover crops, a rye cover crop or an oak cover crop, improving water quality 30%. And those practices still allow us to grow corn and soybeans in the off season. So many of us started thinking about cover crops because of data like that from the Iowa Nutrient Reduction Strategy. And we saw data from tile monitoring sites on fields that the Iowa Soybean Association evaluated. So we see here on the left-hand axis, tile nitrate loads in milligrams per liter. And we see those dots that are brown are tiles on fields that did not have cover crops, and red are tiles draining fields that did have cover crops. And so we see over the season that cover crops have a marked improvement on water quality. And so a lot of us were on TeamCoverCrops for water quality. And we were talking a lot, and we still do, but we were talking mostly exclusively about how cover crops improve water quality. And that got us a certain number of farmers to try cover crops, those really interested in water quality. Other farmers came to cover crops, and other practitioners messaged about the benefits of cover crops based on erosion. We could see reduced erosion on our fields, especially on side hills and those sloping fields. We could see less erosion when we had a strong cover crop in place. And so we started messaging about the benefits to reducing erosion because of cover crops. And again, we got a certain number of farmers to try the practice because of that message. And so why are we even talking about cover crops? Like, why is it an important practice, and why did we even come to it? You know, we've been farming here for a long time, and so why are cover crops so important for water quality and soil erosion? And so I think it's important just to remember that Iowa's cropping history has made a major shift since the 60s. And so we know that corn has covered Iowa's landscape on about 60% of it for the past 100 years. And corn grows in the summertime. But opposite corn, previous to the 60s and 70s, we used to grow cool season plants like small grains and legumes, plants similar to cover crops. And then in the 60s and 70s, we made a shift towards soybeans and away from small grains. And so soybeans are a warm season plant like corn. They grow at the same time as corn. And that unfortunately results in a large fallow period between the harvest of corn and the planting of soybeans, or the harvest of soybeans and the planting of corn. And so when we got rid of those cool season plants off of our landscape, we started to see problems with soil erosion, problems with water quality, and overall less resiliency of our farming system. And so cover crops are one example of a cool season plant that we can stick into that winter fallow that our current dominant system sadly gives us. So when I think about all this, I wonder, okay, so why can't we get farmers to do cover crops based on water quality improvements and soil health improvements and soil erosion reductions? Like, why isn't that maybe something that would drive 80,000 Iowa farmers to use cover crops? And so a number of years ago, we partnered with an organization to look at the greenness of cover crops across the state of Iowa using satellites. And so we can see here on this map the numbers of acres in a county based on satellite imagery of cover crops. And so the green counties are those that have higher rates of cover crops, and the brown counties are those that have lower rates of cover crops. And so when I looked at this map initially, I thought, okay, well, north central Iowa, we do a lot of tillage, it's heavier soils. There's a myth that we can't do no-till in these central area heavy soils. So maybe that's why we don't have cover crop adoption in the north central part of the state of Iowa. And in the southeastern part of the state of Iowa, we have more rolling hills, we have more HEL compliance issues, and so maybe that's why we do more cover crops. We just have a different culture of stewardship in southeast Iowa. Maybe that's the reason. Then I see this map from Iowa State on the percentage of a county that is cash rented versus owner operated. And this is data from 2012. And so I'm in a meeting and I see this map and I'm like, wow, that map is basically my cover crop map. And so this map says that counties that are yellow, that are lighter colored, have lower rates of cash rent basically in the county, meaning less of the land is rented that's farmed. Counties that are dark brown are counties that have higher percentages of that county are cash rented, that are farmed. And so we've got to realize that there are a whole host of other things going on that are driving farmers to adopt and to not adopt cover crops. And so just a water quality or soil erosion message is only going to get us so many farmers trying this practice because of the other stuff that's going on. And so that's really made me think about a new message, that we need new messages. And I started hearing our farmers who have used cover crops for a long time start using different messages about ways to sell cover crops to their neighbors or to people that they would come in contact with. And so I'm going to go through a set of messages that I feel are our new messages, our new sales pitch on how to get cover crops. And it's based off of what farmers have been seeing as they've used cover crops more. So this is a picture here of Jeremy Gustafson, who farms in Boone County. And Jeremy, was learning about cover crops a number of years ago, and he started to do a trial with practical farmers comparing soybean yield with and without a cover crop. And he didn't initially believe that he was going to see anything else but no difference in soybean yield. But what ended up happening is he started to see really good weed control from those cover crops. This message, Team Cover Crops for Better Weed Control, is probably the ¡1 way we can sell this practice to a larger majority of farmers, because we can cut our costs on herbicide costs that affords us the cost of that cover crop. So I'm going to go through Jeremy's trial. So Jeremy planted a field of rye in the fall previous to this spring, which is the picture on the screen. Then he killed strips ahead of soybean planting and killed strips at the day of soybean planting, which is the at planting of cash crop green strips. Then he planted soybeans across this whole field. This is what his map looks like. We do set up trials in a randomized replicated way that are rigorous. And so you can see his outline here. And this was Jeremy planting into those late terminated strips that had a lot of cover crop biomass, a lot of control of weeds. This was scary. This was not business as usual to him or to his neighbors, of course. And the one thing that Jeremy learned was come, July, August, he had a really thick residue mat in between those soybeans, and they were really controlling weeds. So he decided to treat those late terminated strips differently. And so I just want to show yield data. Jeremy is Gustafson on this graph, and he did this study in 2016 and 2015. And Boyer is a second farmer, Jack Boyer, up in the Rhinebeck area, who also did this study. And we see across the treatments, whether it's a brown early terminated rye or a green late terminated rye, that soybean yield was similar. There was no impact on soybean yield negatively, which was the one thing that we were hoping to see, and like the only thing we were thinking we would see. But then Jeremy and Jack both treated their strips differently, and they were able to save on herbicide costs. That's what those dollar figures are up there, because of the way that they managed their rye ahead of soybeans. So it didn't happen every year with this study, but 2 out of the 4 years, they did see dramatic differences in costs. And so that helped us think about ways that we could afford the cover crop. Cover crops are about $30 an acre. So in Jack's case, he was $10 ahead just by using rye in his system. So that kind of got us thinking, okay, well, maybe there's some cost savings, input savings message that we should be thinking about. So then we had farmers who have cattle also think about grazing cover crops or feeding cover crops as silage. Right now is the perfect time to be taking rye for silage. The rye is in the right stage to take it for really high feed quality. So we had farmers who had cows in confined animal feedlots and also cow-calf pairs grazing, evaluate their economics. They use the calculator that's shown here at the bottom, the link to the extension Iowa State calculator. And one of the producers who farms up in Northwest Iowa was able to see a significant return, $259 per acre return, because he saved so much on feeding cows stored hay, which is the biggest expense that farmers have in their system with cattle. So again, the cover crop costs $30 an acre. This farmer in 2016 had a 259 per acre return, and in 2017, a 218 per acre return. So maybe we need to be on the message team cover crops for feeding cover crops to cattle. You know, that's a way to save on input costs. So what about fertilizer? We hear a lot from farmers in other states, in Indiana and Ohio, that they're getting away with less NPK because they've used cover crops. So this is a picture of Jack Boyer here with PFI's research scientist Stephen Galens, who runs the Cooperators program. They're in a trial, you know, collecting some data. And so Jack wanted to test out, could he drop his fertilizer, his total fertilizer to corn, because he's used cover crops so many years in a row on his farm. So Jack again set up randomized replicated strips, just like the map that I'd shown of Jeremy's farm. And these are corn yields from those strips. So we have bushels per acre on the y-axis, and then the blue bars are the yields from each individual rep where there was only 130 pounds of nitrogen applied, and the red bars are the yields from each individual replication where 180 pounds of nitrogen was applied, which that would be the typical nitrogen rate for that area. And so we see no statistical difference between the two treatments, whether we put on 130 pounds of nitrogen or 180 pounds of nitrogen, meaning a 50 pound per nitrogen per acre savings in fertilizer. So what if we want to push that system even more and reduce our fertilizer bill even more? So we've had farmers who are in that warm season corn bean system think about diversifying and adding in a third crop. And so the third crop would be those crops that I mentioned earlier, things like oats and wheat and rye and barley, planted in the fall before or the spring prior to when corn would normally be planted. And so those crops are going to take the spot of corn or soybeans in a year. And then we have been encouraging farmers, and farmers themselves have been realizing this, to plant green manure legumes, legume cover crops with those small grains. So farmers might be adding in red clover with oats as an underseeding, or they may come back onto a rye crop and frost seed red clover onto that rye crop in the spring. And then that red clover grows all season long. And then the following spring, farmers would kill the red clover and go back to corn. And that's where we can have a dramatic reduction in fertilizer because the red clover is our nitrogen source. Other cover crops like crimson clover, cowpeas, different diverse mixes that are planted in the summertime are also an option, hairy vetch, and those green manure cover crops would give us maybe not as much nitrogen as red clover because they're not growing as long, but we would have, you know, a system where we're growing biological nitrogen in this diverse extended rotation. So we have a better balance of cool and warm season plants when we go to this 3-crop rotation. Okay, so how much fertilizer could we save if we go ahead and take a year off of corn and beans and grow small grains with a legume cover crop? So Tim Searin farms down in kind of the southeast Iowa area, and Tim wanted to see how much nitrogen he could cut from adding red clover to his system with his small grain. So Tim says here, you know, incorporating more legumes into my rotation lets me cut back on N fertilizer. And Tim is confident in that comment because he's done the research to see how much he can cut. Okay, so I'll set this up. Tim plants small grains in the fall after soybean harvest. Then in the spring, and his small grain of choice is cereal rye. Then in the spring, he frost seeds red clover into that standing rye. And by frost seeding, I mean you go out and you blow the seed on the soil surface, and then by the action of freezing and thawing that occurs in the February-March window, the seed gets into the soil and sort of plants itself because of that action that occurs in that freeze-thaw cycle in the spring. So Tim goes out and establishes the red clover on top of that rye cover crop that now is going to become a small grain seed crop. And he establishes strips and skips. So he has a set of strips with no red clover and a set of strips with red clover. Those would be the red bars on the map. And then on top of those treatments, he applies different rates of nitrogen fertilizer because we want to see what the fertilizer replacement rate is. So we can see here on Tim's map on the red clover strips that followed the rye. So this is the next spring ahead of corn. Tim applies either 23 units of N that has the red clover, or 100 units of N that has the red clover, or 143 units of N, which does not have red clover, or 190 units of N, which does not have red clover. And so the 190 is probably a little high for his normal rate of nitrogen, and 143 is maybe a little low. So this range of nitrogen just gives us a good evaluation to see how much N can that red clover provide us. Okay, so again, on the y-axis is bushels of corn per acre. On the x-axis now are those different strips and skips, so the clover and the no clover strips and skips, and then the different nitrogen rates on top of those. And so where we have the 23 pounds of nitrogen plus clover, we did have statistically lower corn yield. We see where there's no star, that means there's a statistical difference. And so we did sacrifice some corn yield when we only put on 23 pounds of N plus red clover. But we see where we put on 100 units of N versus the 143 or even the 190, that we have statistically similar corn yields to the no clover and red clover plus 100 units of N treatment. And so then we can say that clover in this case gave us a 90 pound per N, a 90 pounds of nitrogen per acre replacement rate. So in Jack's scenario, where he was doing just constant, basically rye cover cropping, sometimes rye with maybe a brassica mixed in there in the 2-year system, he was able to cut about 50 units of nitrogen after a long period of time of using cover crops. And then when Tim Searin, whose system I'm showing here, went to an extended crop rotation, adding in a third crop, plus a larger green manure legume, he was then able to drop his fertilizer costs by 90 pounds of nitrogen. So that, those are cost savings that then those farmers are able to control, right? They're not feeling the shock of a high fertilizer rate when that happens in the marketplace, because they're controlling their costs more either by continuous cover cropping with like a rye cover crop, or in Tim's case, by adding in those green manure legumes where we can grow more of our own nitrogen. So that's the benefits to the farmer. Those are some of the messages that we need to be thinking about when we want to go out to a broader group of farmers who haven't yet tried cover crops. So as we've been talking about this, as farmers have been talking about this to their neighbors and to others, we've had different companies come to PFI to want to know more about the stewardship types of practices that PFI farmers are doing. So we've had companies partner with us, especially those in the animal supply chain, on how they can reduce their greenhouse gas footprint. And so when we're showing that fertilizer data, we're actually showing a way for companies like these on the screen to cut their greenhouse gases that are tied to fertilizer. Fertilizer is a big greenhouse gas contributor because of the energy it takes to break that triple nitrogen bond. And so their interest is TeamCoverCrops for basically low carbon corn. How can they have corn in their supply chain that is fed to animals that then are sold under their brands of McDonald's hamburgers or whatnot, that is a low carbon corn, since corn is one of the larger greenhouse gas emitters in their footprints. So a small grain in rotation can really make the case for low carbon corn to be possible. We're allowed to cut around at least 90 units of fertilizer. And so that's a big reduction in greenhouse gases. So I want to show a study that my colleague Alicia Bauer did a couple of years ago. So she has been collecting data from small grain farmers in our system. And so we put that data into a platform called the Field Print Calculator and into a platform called the Cool Farm tool. And the Field Print Calculator basically pings some different models on what greenhouse gas emissions are for practices, as does the Cool Farm tool, and then we get scores based on the production practices that we've put into those models. And here we've graphed the field print calculator. Average greenhouse gases per acre is on the y-axis, and the cool farm tool, or CFT, average total greenhouse gas emissions per acre, is on the x-axis. And so the dots are farmers and their production practices, and where they fall along this line of either high emissions to the right or lower emissions to the left. And so why do we have this spread of farm production practices? So when we have farmers applying manure and accounting for that manure and therefore reducing fertilizer and counting the legume cover crop in their system because they've added a small grain, we see them result in lower emissions. They also are managing their weeds in a different way, using those cover crops to manage weeds, using less passes. And so all that contributes to a lower greenhouse gas footprint for the corn that they're growing in that system. The farmers on the higher emission part of the scale, they're not reducing fertilizer. So they're not doing good accounting of either manure in their system or a legume cover crop in their system. And then they're maybe using same amount of pest management practices, crop production passes, than what they actually probably need when we go to a diverse rotation. And so we see companies being very interested in data like this, where we have farmers that are at different ends of the spectrum of greenhouse gas emissions per bushel of corn that they're growing. And what's great is that these farmers in these cases didn't actually sacrifice any corn yield. So when we have farmers who do better cost accounting of fertilizer, that's not just good for their pocketbook, that's also good for these companies that are interested in bringing a lower carbon corn to market to improve the greenhouse gas footprints of their supply chains. So in this case, we have a 56% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions per acre simply by growing a diverse rotation, adding in those legume cover crops, and then actually accounting for the nitrogen that those biological sources of N give us. Okay, so another message that I've been hearing recently, and this isn't research that Practical Farmers has participated in, but I wanted to share it. Wayne Fredericks is a PFI member who is really meticulous at data collection. Wayne just has a lot of data going way back on his farm, and he's been using no-till for a long time, and then recently in the last 8 or so years has transitioned to adding cover crops to his system. And so he was in conversations with folks from the former Soil Tilth Lab, the National Laboratory for Ag and the Environment in Ames, and he was noticing like less yield variability across his farm. Like low spots were performing better, high knobs were performing better, and the whole sort of field average just was coming up. And so he worked with NLA staff to see, like, statistically, was he seeing differences in yield variability, less yield variability across the field because of this combination of cover crops and no-till. So these are two different geostatistical maps, and I'm just going to explain what you're seeing here. I'm going to show two of these, one for his cornfield and one for his soybean field. So the top map, that is, you know, the lay of the land of his field, his Fredericks East field. And you can see as the colors go closer to purple and pink, we have higher yields. And then as they go lower to blues, we have lower yields. And the picture on the top is his corn yields from basically 2004, when he was just doing reduced tillage, before he had added cover crops to his system. So he did corn with no tillage for 12 years when the picture at the top was taken. And so we can see pretty good variability of that field. Yields are kind of all over the place, and we can see where those low spots would be, are probably those green areas where it's just yielding less. And then he adds cover crops to his system. And so then the bottom picture is his field after the combination of cover crops and no-till for, you know, the 12 years of no-till and then 6 more years with cover crops. So 18 years total. And so then the corn yields here, we see, oh, an evening out of that field. And what NLA staff from USDA are saying is it's because that cover crop and no-till are helping just manage water a lot differently on that field. and that's improving the total yield of that field. And so they looked at a second field. This is a different field of weigh-ins that has soy yields. And again, we see the same issue. We see all yields coming up, and we see an evening out of the variability of the field, so less yield variability. This, to me, is probably one of our strongest messages to farmers who haven't yet tried cover crops. Normally, they would be using nitrogen to sort of bring the field average up and have their crop insurance APH, the average production history, for example, be more uniform across the field and allow them to manage risk better. But in this case, Wayne has been able to use a combination of soil health practices, no-till and cover crops, to change that overall variability of the field. So this is really exciting stuff. And I know the Enlay crew and Wayne and some other farmers are adding to this data set to see, does this shake out all the time? Do we see this all the time? Because if we are seeing this regularly, this is a huge positive message for those farmers that haven't yet started with cover crops. Okay, and then my last one, this comes from a farmer sort of in the Northeast Iowa area, Adam Nekanaki. He shared this in a annual conference session that he gave a couple of years ago at Practical Farmers of Iowa. And so we've been hearing farmers say that the fields that they're planting that have had cover crops for a number of years are more fit. They can get into the field maybe a little earlier than the neighbor. They can maybe spray that field in June after a large rainfall. They're back in the field when others might not be. The last two fall harvests have really shown this, where farmers who are no-till or low-till and cover crop systems are harvesting on time, while neighbors who are full width tillage are not, and they're out of the field extra days when we need to get the crop in. So Adam had finished up his harvest. He farms across the road. The picture on the left is across the road from the picture on the right. And his neighbor had asked him to help with harvest. And when Adam showed up to the field, he encountered this very, very wet field. And of course, tile drainage is everywhere. That is a standard practice, so it's not a tile drain issue. And these fields are very close to each other, so they should be very similar in soil type and drainage. And so the real difference is that Adam has gone to low-till, no-till system and cover crops for several years. And so when Adam showed up to the neighbor's field, clearly not much was going to get harvested that day. They were still going to be out because it was just so wet. And I'll show a video that Adam shared. That's a picture of Adam at his field day last summer. Let me see if this video is going to work here. So this is in the neighbor's field. And so, we never want to go into a field when it's not fit. Of course, when we're under stress during harvest, sometimes we make choices that are just things that have to get done. But then these kinds of ruts we're going to be paying for long term because we've really damaged the structure of that soil. And the field's probably going to have to be worked the next spring just to even things out. Now, could we have gotten away from that if we had started using cover crops and low-till systems years before? Probably. We're having farmers tell us that they're seeing a difference in field fitness. And this to me is also a second message that's going to help everybody save at least time, which is money, in the fall, so that we can be harvesting on time and hopefully planting sooner. The field is just more fit for us. So I think our new message overall, based off of all those individual hashtag messages, is that we need to now be on team cover crops for better crops. No longer can we just be thinking about cover crops for water quality and soil health and reductions in soil erosions. Those are the additional benefits that we get, but our sales pitch has to be that cover crops makes it easier for us to do corn and soybeans, makes it easier for us to grow better crops. So has this made any difference? Are we seeing an impact on this change in messaging, on PFI's push for greater cover crop adoption? So in survey data that PFI takes from multiple different events, our field days, our webinars, our annual conference, farmers tell us these are the things they're changing on their farm. So personal changes, farm level changes that are occurring show us a strong message that soil health is changing on farms, that farmers are changing to no-till practices. They're adding cover crops. That's probably the biggest word on there. They're going organic, which means they're going into extended crop rotations to help maybe grow more of their own nitrogen. They're changing their weed control. They're going to strip tillage. So these are great personal changes that farmers are telling us they're doing. We also see within our membership a huge adoption of cover crops. So of our corn soybean farmers, 73% of them are using cover crops, and 50% of them are adding or are using small grains in rotation. This is fantastic. This is what we want to see, and we want to be able to lead other farmers to PFI so they can learn about how to save time and money by adding these practices. We also see across the landscape, Iowa really stood out in the last census of ag data, where we had grown from 380,000 acres of cover crops the previous census to the last census being almost 1 million acres of cover crops. And so you can see Iowa standing out on that map compared to surrounding neighboring states as really adding a lot more cover crop acres. And so a lot of this promotion, a lot of these benefits that we see from adding cover crops to the system have also caught the eye of other consumer packaged good companies. We've been working with folks like Unilever and Pepsi to do cost share programs on cover crops. As we've had farmers learn about cover crops and share that message of what works on farm, we've had companies want to increase the sustainability of their supply chains on the soybean side or the corn side, on the grain side. And so we've been managing cover crop, privately funded cover crop cost share programs for these companies for the last several years. And you can see there the footprints of those programs. And for anybody on the webinar who is in the state of Iowa, it would be awesome if you would promote this cost share. Our goal this year is to reach approximately 500 farmers to participate in these cost share programs and have those companies be able to, say, look, we're investing in farmers in a practice on farm that's going to not only benefit our goals for sustainability in our supply chains, but also benefit farms long term with greater soil health on farm. And then lastly, I'd say we saw a really big win in Iowa. A group of organizations, including Practical Farmers, worked with the Iowa Department of Ag and Land Stewardship to offer a crop insurance discount for farmers that are using cover crops. This program is still open. It's going to go beyond the 3-year pilot, which ended last year, because it's been such a success. Farmers get $5 an acre off of their off their crop insurance premium when they add cover crops to their system. And we've seen now Illinois has added this program. They added it last fall, and hopefully they'll continue. And we're working with other states around the Midwest to add these programs for their farmers as well. So this to me shows that when we work to change our message on practices, on conservation practices, to beyond just the great environmental stewardship benefits that we get, like improved water quality and reductions in soil erosion, we can start to message to those farmers who haven't tried practices like cover crops yet. And that also helps us catch the eye of companies that want to invest in practices like this, in crop insurance, maybe benefiting farmers who do practices like cover crops across the United States, not just in states like Iowa. And so we really want to make sure that we're meeting farmers where they're at and then bringing them along on this journey to adding practices that not only benefit water quality and soil health, but also can benefit the way that they grow crops like corn and soybeans. And so if we want to turn the picture on the left, which we should not have ever again, into the picture on the right, which is a beautiful green field of cover crops, I think we need to change that cover crop message. So with that, I'll open it up for any questions that anyone would have.
All right, that was great. We do have one question in waiting at the moment. Heidi has a question Oh, sorry. Heidi has a question that she sent to Q&A, and yeah, you can either use the Q&A box or the chat box. I can see them both, Hannah, so I can read them out. So Heidi Ackerman asks, how are the small grains that are being readopted by PFI members being utilized after production? What markets exist for the grain and straw?
Yeah. So this is the big need, right? We need the market so that we can drive the adoption. So we are hitting three places to drive small grain market demand. First place that we had started working a while ago was the food sector. So could we work on increasing food grade oats? Iowa used to grow 6 million acres of oats in the state, and a lot of that went to food grade oats at factories that are like in Cedar Rapids, for example, at the Quaker Mill. And so today we work with Oatly, which is an oat milk company, to buy oats from Iowa and southern Minnesota farmers to make oat milk out of. We also work with a company named Seven Sundays. They make a muesli. They're out of the Twin Cities. They also are buying food grade oats from Iowa and Minnesota farmers, and we have been wooing them to increase their purchasing of food grade oats. Unfortunately, we haven't gotten some of the big food grade buyers that are out there. We do network with them, but they have not changed their purchasing from like Canadian oats, for example. So food grade oats is number one. Number two is the feed sector. So we have been working with Smithfield to purchase wheat and oats out of two southern Iowa facilities. And those small grains are going into not just hog rations, but also into the dog food sector. And so the pet food sector. And so feed is probably going to be our largest market for small grains, and we want to continue to build that market and make it much larger because we can really drive a lot of small grain demand through feed. And then the third place is cover crop seed production. So if we're going to cover 10 million acres of Iowa with cover crops, we're going to need a lot of seed to cover that. And so why should we just be importing that seed from North Dakota? We can grow a lot of that seed here and create those diverse rotations. So we've been working with 10 cover crop businesses around the state of Iowa, not just to ramp up their capacity to seed cover crops, but also to contract with farmers to grow oats mostly for certified cover crop seed, and then some rye as we learn how to treat these things like a seed crop, grow rye and oats that then will go into the cover crop market here in the state. So those are the three markets that we are working to expand.
Very cool. So that seed one in particular is something that I've heard a bit about. Just working with the DNR, I hear occasionally, oh, well, if you guys want us to plant so many cover crops, where are we going to get the seed? And our kind of response to that is always, boy, that sounds like a market opportunity for somebody. So we've always been interested in expanding that from the DNR perspective, just in a watershed improvement kind of stance. Obviously, on my side, we're kind of stuck in that water quality and soil health improvement that cover crops do, but I really appreciated the expansion of messaging to include other benefits, especially those benefits that are purely for the farmer, because a lot of times conservation practices are improving benefits for everybody else, maybe not so much the farmer. I mean, the farmer gets a lot of benefits directly in their field and their peace of mind as far as their contributions to water quality, but if some of these are improving their out or inputs as well, it's a great dual message there. So another question coming in from Marshall McDaniel is, what's the main approach you would use to get those upper Des Moines lobe renters to adopt cover crops?
Yes. So the picture here on the screen where I have a rye cover crop, it's been flown on into standing corn stalks in the fall, and then this is the next spring. This is actually former Secretary of Ag Bill Northeast farm up in Spirit Lake, so Des Moines lobe, northern Iowa. So this is what we need to see on their fields, because this field is more than likely going to go into a soybean crop the next year. And because we can almost cover the entire cost of this cover crop by cutting our herbicides, either cut an herbicide pass or mess around with reducing our residual usage, or glyphosate application, like mess around with herbicides in the soybean phase without sacrificing soybean yield. This is the best way that we can really mass deploy cover crops across the whole state, but particularly in places where we have rented land, because we need the ROI to cash flow right away. We need a reduction in costs in the next year's cash crop to afford us that previous fall's cover crop. Now, I will say Des Moines loam farmers might want to work those corn stalks first, and so they could work the corn stalks, blow on a fall fertilizer with rye cover crop, and then have that, broadcasted cover crop out there for the next year's soybean field. And the fertilizer that they might be blowing on would just be phosphorus and potassium, not nitrogen, for example, because we're going to go to soybeans. So that's probably the cheapest way for us to get cover crops on, and also the best chance for us to reduce the total herbicide expense the next year. Separately from that, we need landowners to kick in the cash for this. Landowners' assets will be maintained better and will prove maybe over time to have an increase in their value in a marketplace if we value soil health differently on how we sell farmland. And so landowners, I'd say if they're being smart, will start paying for cover crops for their tenant, and at least for the first several years, just pay for it out of pocket. And then maybe over a certain, year 4, 5, 6, split the cost, for example. The landlords have a vested interest in protecting their asset. And especially if one day we buy and sell farmland on soil health or carbon amounts, we should get started today as landlords, investing in that asset and protecting it. And cover crops is the best way that we could do that.
Great, great. On that carbon question, I had one that came to mind when you were going through that the greenhouse gas reduction section. So 56% reduction in some of your better performing operations. Was that counting any sequestration, any carbon sequestration that's done by cover crops, or was that all just in like diesel fuel reduction?
Right. So the two platforms, the field print calculator, which was what was on the y-axis, and the cool farm tool, which was on the x-axis, look at things just a little bit differently. So I don't know if I can go back here and show you. I'll just show you this real quick. So the field print calculator only looks at emissions. It does not look at sequestration. So we'll notice that its scores were all positive. So here we go. So the field print calculator stops at 0 because it's only emissions. There's no sequestration accounted for. The soil erosion metric in field print calculator is not attached to the greenhouse gas metric. So they're separate. The cool farm tool, however, you can see that it goes negative, and that's because it accounts for sequestration in addition to emissions. So long story short, when we are working with corn farmers in this scenario, we see them, yes, reducing passes, reducing fertilizer, and those are all emissions. And then with the cool farm tool, when we add a cover crop into the system, we do get some sequestration benefit from adding a cover crop. Of course, it's not the levels of sequestration that we would see from like perennial polyculture prairies, for example, right? It's nowhere near those levels. It's mostly just, in that top layer of organic matter improvements. So long story short, they just measure things a little bit differently.
Sure. Okay. Yeah, I've heard a few different talks on the sequestration side of things, and boosting that organic matter is thought by many to be sort of a quick and easy way to sequester some immediate carbon. So I've always been interested in seeing that cover crop message expand to that, knowing that it has limited impact probably, but maybe long term really can lock away some carbon. Any other questions out there? Otherwise, we've got about 5 minutes left. And see if I can come up with another question or two. We're getting some appreciation here from a few. Marshall McDaniel followed up to say that about working with the Des Moines lobe, the key is working through the landlords. I'd say that that's definitely true. There's been some recent research, I think, out of Iowa State And by, by the way, I noted that many of the people pictured in your slides had Iowa State hats on, which I appreciate as an alumni. Um, but some research out of Iowa State, and I think it was from Learning Farms, that says that many of the landlords that are kind of uh, key contact points for these some of these farms are not actually the sort of East Coast, West Coast sort of absentee landlords. They're actually just in town nearby, maybe where the farm is at. And so there's still kind of some local messaging that can be done. Do you have any experience with those types of studies with PFI?
Yeah, so we would definitely be citing research from Iowa Learning Farms and what researchers at Iowa State, tell us about the types of landlords that are out there. So I'd say these are the types of phone calls that we receive into our office. A landlord who probably lives in town, maybe is a generation off the farm, has inherited farmland, or might be a spouse of a farmer, and they're wanting their tenant to make a change. And so they contact PFI. Actually, Jorgen Rose on our staff fields a lot of these calls and wants to figure out how to protect their asset. They've heard about cover crops, or they've heard about organic systems or diverse rotation. They want to make a change. And so we have helped some walk through that process on how to have a conversation with their tenant, how to get started, putting in some skin by paying for it, or at least going and getting cost share together. And then, letting the farmer have all the cost share to cover the cost of the practice. So there are those cases. I will say though, just like the middle majority of farmers who haven't used cover crops yet, we definitely have that in the landlord pool. And so if we're going to really ramp up landlords' investments in cover crops, we probably need something more like a tax credit or tax exemption, something
Sure.
that shows up on their accountant's sheet that their accountant is asking them, are you taking advantage of this tax break?
Hmm.
And then pay back the county in some other way, right? Because we
Gotcha.
really need them to realize, I think, the financial benefit to it in the short term, which would be the tax exemption, because that long-term asset change, it takes a long time. And we
Yep.
currently don't buy and sell on carbon. And so, it's just prepping for the future.
Gotcha. Yeah. Okay. Ian Willard, with DNR asks, have you found that neighbors would be more likely to adopt these practices if they see people having success with them? So this kind of plays into that, like, you change the landscape green with cover crops. Is there kind of a viral aspect to it? Sorry, that's a bad word to use these days, but where neighbors are seeing more green on the fields at weird times of year, and they're starting to ask questions and wanting to do it themselves.
Yeah, so I can tell areas where we have practical farmers members who have been preaching this for a long time. You can see their impact in areas where they started doing cover crops, and then slowly but surely their neighbors start to see, like, the farmer hasn't failed, they haven't gone out of business. Maybe they're on the field sooner. I had a farmer tell me last fall that his neighbor, who has been full with tillage, is uninterested in things like this, called him while the PFI cover crop farmer was talking to me, called him and said, how in the heck are you harvesting right now? And we are a week out because there was, recent rain last fall during harvest. And the PFI cover crop farmer just said, I'm using cover crops and reducing my tillage so I can get on this field sooner. Maybe you should consider that. So I think these last two falls, that message has really come forward. It's just so obvious that people are out there sooner. So yes, I think slowly but surely people will start seeing that those neighbors that have been using cover crops are not crazy, and that there is some real benefit to that better message, that growing crops better message.
Steve Hopkins, also with DNR. Are private agronomists and cooperatives on board with this message about cover crops? So the new or modified messages that are, talking about more the crop benefits of them.
So I'll say that those co-ops and those agronomists who are selling services and not just jugs of product are on board. And there are a dozen or so, I'd say, really forward-thinking agronomists that are trying to sell more than just herbicides. They're selling crop, protection services, agronomy, soil health services, conservation agronomy, as it's probably termed. And so those folks are, keeping those customers happy by providing them more than just sales of products. Is that anywhere near the majority? No. And until we change the scheme on our quotas for those sales agronomists and how they're rewarded, we are not going to see big changes in messaging from that sector. It's not in their best interest, I'll just say.
Sure. Okay, I think we'll call it there. Thanks so much again, Sarah, for joining us today and providing some awesome information on cover crops. Just as a reminder to everybody, we are close to getting the video for last week's talk out, and then we'll be processing the video for this week's talk. So we'll have a YouTube page set up, hopefully within the next week or so, to host some of these. We'll get the Chris Jones one on there, as I've said previously as well. Reminder again that the conference this summer is going to go all digital. The registration page is open. Head to swcs.org for that. And then maybe check out the swag pages too. You can get a t-shirt or a pint glass to celebrate the conference. We'll all be raising a toast to those virtually, or with those virtually, when the conference rolls around in July.